Manny Pacquiao arrived at the small boxing gym in Quezon City on a humid Thursday afternoon, seeking a discreet place to train away from media spotlights. The establishment, known only by locals, was a humble place where young dreamers came to learn the fundamentals of pugilism. The peeling walls displayed faded photos of local champions, and the familiar scent of sweat and leather permeated the air. While Manny adjusted his gloves near the main ring, a noise from the back of the gym caught his attention. It was the rhythmic and determined sound of someone hitting a heavy bag, but there was something different in the cadence. It lacked the typical fluidity of an experienced boxer. Curious, Manny walked toward the sound, passing old equipment and cracked mirrors that reflected the raw reality of that environment. In the darkest corner of the gym, illuminated only by a solitary bulb, Manny saw a young man of approximately 20 years training with fierce determination. What most impressed him wasn't the boy's imperfect technique, but rather his physical condition. His right leg was visibly atrophied, forcing him to constantly adapt his balance and movement. Even so, each punch was executed with a passion that transcended his physical limitations. The young fighter hadn't noticed Manny's presence, completely absorbed in his training. Sweat ran down his thin face as he repeated basic combinations, pausing occasionally to adjust his posture due to his disability. His clothes were simple, patched training shorts and a worn t-shirt that had seen better days. Despite the circumstances, there was a dignity in his movements that spoke of someone who refused to accept limitations. Manny watched for several minutes, mesmerized by the raw determination he witnessed. He remembered his own youth, when he trained in similar conditions, but recognized he had never faced the physical challenges this young man clearly overcame daily. There was something about the boy's absolute commitment that deeply touched the world champion's heart. When the young man finally stopped to rest, leaning against the heavy bag and breathing heavily, it was then he noticed the familiar figure watching him. His eyes widened in recognition and surprise, but instead of the typical request for autographs or photos, he simply nodded respectfully, as if not wanting to bother. There was a natural humility in his reaction that impressed Manny even more. The encounter of these two worlds, a world champion at the peak of his career and a young fighter facing unimaginable adversities, was about to create waves that would spread far beyond the walls of that humble gym. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge prejudices, inspire a generation, and demonstrate that true greatness in boxing goes far beyond victories and titles. Manny cautiously approached the young man, not wanting to seem condescending or intrusive. The boy, still panting from the intense training, tried to straighten respectfully, but his deficient leg made him waver slightly. Manny gestured for him to remain seated on the improvised bench near the heavy bag, and he himself settled on an old chair nearby. The young man introduced himself as Carlos Mendoza, 22 years old, and his voice carried both pride and vulnerability. He explained that he had been born with a deformity in his right leg, the result of complications during birth. He grew up in one of Quezon City's poorest communities, where his physical condition often made him a target for mockery and discrimination. But instead of letting himself be discouraged, Carlos found in boxing a way to channel his frustration and prove his worth. Carlos told how he discovered the gym 3 years ago, when he was feeling sick on the street and one of the trainers helped him. Seeing his situation, the elderly trainer, Toti June, allowed him to train for free in exchange for help with cleaning and maintaining the place. Carlos arrived every day before dawn to sweep the gym, clean equipment, and then trained with borrowed equipment until late at night. Carlos's passion for boxing was pure and without pretensions. He didn't dream of fame or fortune, but simply the opportunity to prove that his disability didn't define his capabilities. He had adapted techniques to compensate for his physical limitation, developing a unique style that emphasized lateral movement and precise counterattacks. His training sessions were solitary, as other boxers often saw him as a curiosity rather than a legitimate competitor. Manny was impressed not only with Carlos's technical adaptability, but with his philosophy about the sport. The young man spoke about boxing not as individual conquest, but as a way to inspire others who faced similar adversities. He mentioned letters he received from children with disabilities, thanking him for showing that physical limitations didn't mean the end of dreams. The conversation revealed that Carlos had never had an official fight. Promoters and organizers consistently rejected him, some citing safety concerns, others simply not wanting a spectacle at their events. This systematic rejection hadn't diminished his dedication. If anything, it had intensified his determination to prove his worth through tireless training. When Carlos finished his story, there were unshed tears in his eyes, but also unshakable resolve. Manny realized he was facing something rare in the boxing world, someone who fought not for himself, but for all who had been underestimated. It was evident that Carlos possessed something many world champions lost along the way: the purity of passion for the sport. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Manny knew this encounter wouldn't be just another inspirational conversation he would forget in a few days. Carlos represented everything boxing could be in its purest form: determination, overcoming obstacles, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. It was time for Manny to decide whether he would do something that would change not only Carlos's life, but potentially an entire industry's perception of what it means to be a fighter. In the days following the encounter, Manny couldn't get Carlos out of his mind. During his own training sessions, he found himself thinking about the raw determination he had witnessed in that humble gym. He decided to return, this time bringing Freddie Roach, his historic trainer, without explaining the true reason for the visit. When they arrived at the gym, Carlos was in his usual spot, training with the same intensity Manny had observed before. Freddie, initially skeptical about why they were there, became intrigued when Manny asked him to silently observe the young fighter. For 20 minutes, they watched Carlos work, noting his unique technical adaptations and the fluidity with which he compensated for his physical limitation. Freddie, with decades of experience training world champions, was impressed against his initial expectations. He noticed that Carlos had instinctively developed techniques that many boxers took years to learn. His ability to generate power at unusual angles, a direct result of his adaptations, created a unique fighting style that could be effective against opponents unaccustomed to such an approach. After observing Carlos, Manny made a decision that would shock not only Freddie, but the entire boxing community. He announced his intention to personally train with Carlos, not as charity or a promotional gesture, but as a legitimate sparring partner. Freddie initially protested, worried about risks to Manny's career, but the champion was resolute in his decision. Manny explained to Freddie that Carlos possessed something many elite fighters lost: genuine hunger and innovation born from necessity. He believed that training with Carlos would not only help the young man, but also rejuvenate his own approach to boxing. He had recognized in Carlos a mirror of his youth, when boxing was about survival and proving people wrong, not about maintaining status. News of Manny's decision spread quickly through the local boxing community. Many saw it as a publicity stunt, others as a poorly thought-out act of charity. Critics argued it was irresponsible for a world champion to risk himself against someone with physical limitations, not out of concern for Carlos, but for potential embarrassment to Manny if something went wrong. Carlos, initially, was overwhelmed by the opportunity, but also worried about the motivations. He didn't want to be treated as a charity case or used for public relations. Manny assured him that the decision was purely based on what he had observed: genuine talent that deserved recognition and development. He promised Carlos he would be treated like any other sparring partner, with equal expectations and standards. The first joint training session was scheduled for the following week, and word had spread enough that several sports journalists and boxing figures appeared to witness. What they would see would challenge preconceptions about disability, ability, and what it truly means to be a fighter. It was the beginning of something that would change not only both fighters' careers, but potentially the entire industry's perspective on inclusion and opportunity. On the morning scheduled for the first training session, the gym was busier than normal. Journalists, other boxers, and curious onlookers crowded the improvised bleachers, all eager to see what would happen when the world champion stepped into the ring with a disabled young man. Carlos arrived earlier than usual, visibly nervous but determined not to waste the opportunity. Manny entered the gym with his characteristic humility, greeting everyone present before heading to the dressing room. His team, including Freddie Roach and other trainers, seemed tense, clearly worried about possible consequences of this unconventional decision. The atmosphere was charged with expectation and skepticism, with many present hoping the session would be brief and without consequences. When both entered the ring, the physical contrast was obvious. Manny, in perfect physical form with decades of experience, versus Carlos, visibly nervous but with eyes burning with determination. The warm-up began with basic exercises, and it quickly became clear that Carlos wasn't there for show. He was prepared to work seriously. The first rounds were cautious, with both fighters feeling each other out. Manny, to many's surprise, didn't hold back in his intensity, treating Carlos like any other sparring partner. Carlos responded height for height, showing that his technical adaptations weren't just compensations, but genuine innovations that created unique angles and opportunities. As the rounds progressed, something unexpected happened. Carlos began to connect with some clean punches, using his unconventional stance to find openings that orthodox fighters typically couldn't exploit. Manny, far from being embarrassed, seemed energized by the challenge, adapting his own approach to deal with a style so different from anything he had faced before. By round 5, the crowd had fallen silent. What began as a spectacle had evolved into a genuine display of skill from both fighters. Carlos was demonstrating that he could not only hold his own, but actually challenge the world champion in ways that surprised everyone present. His counterpunches were particularly effective, timing impeccable as a result of years studying movement without being able to fully participate. When the session finally ended after 8 rounds, both fighters were sweaty and breathing heavily, but smiling. Manny publicly acknowledged that Carlos had taught him several things about angles and adaptability that he planned to incorporate into his own training. Carlos, meanwhile, looked like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. He had proven, to himself and to skeptics, that he belonged in that ring. Post-training interviews were revealing. Manny spoke passionately about how wrong assumptions about disability could be, and how Carlos had reminded him why he fell in love with boxing originally. Carlos, characteristically humble, thanked Manny but emphasized that his goal wasn't to prove critics wrong, but to show others with disabilities that they shouldn't accept limitations imposed by society. It was clear that something special had begun, something that would ripple far beyond the confines of that small gym in Quezon City. In the weeks that followed, training sessions between Manny and Carlos became regular, establishing a routine that benefited both fighters in unexpected ways. Manny discovered that sparring with Carlos forced him to think differently about angulation and movement, while Carlos absorbed decades of knowledge and experience he couldn't obtain any other way. The dynamic between them evolved from a charity meeting to genuine mentorship and mutual respect. Manny began bringing Carlos to other aspects of his training, including work with nutritionists, sports psychologists, and conditioning coaches. Carlos eagerly absorbed every lesson, but also contributed his own insights developed through years of adapting to overcome limitations. Word of their training sessions spread throughout the Filipino boxing community, attracting attention from both local and international promoters. Many came initially out of curiosity, but left impressed by the skill and determination Carlos displayed consistently. His technique continued to improve dramatically under Manny's guidance, but more importantly, his confidence grew exponentially. Manny arranged for Carlos to train with other professional boxers from his stable, exposing him to a variety of styles and levels of competition that had previously been unavailable. Each encounter served as validation that Carlos belonged in the professional ranks. Other fighters began to respect not just his story, but his legitimate ability as a boxer. Media coverage intensified when Manny publicly announced that he believed Carlos was ready for his professional debut. He used his influence to convince a promoter to give Carlos a legitimate opportunity, not as a sideshow but as a serious prospect. The announcement met with mixed reactions, some applauding Manny's vision, others questioning the wisdom of the decision. Carlos himself remained focused and grounded throughout the sudden attention. He continued to wake before dawn to clean the gym, maintained his humble attitude, but also demonstrated growing confidence in interviews and public appearances. He spoke eloquently about representing the disabled community, but emphasized that he wanted to be judged purely based on performance, not sympathy or an inspiration narrative. Training intensified as they prepared for Carlos's professional debut. Manny's entire team became invested in his success, with each coach bringing specialized knowledge to help Carlos maximize his potential. They developed specific strategies that played to his strengths: superior ring IQ, excellent timing, and ability to find unexpected angles of attack. Most remarkably, Carlos began attracting a following of young boxers with disabilities who heard about his story. The gym started seeing regular visits from aspiring fighters who previously thought boxing was impossible for them. Carlos always made time for these visits, demonstrating techniques and sharing experiences, unconsciously building a community that hadn't existed before. As the fight date approached, anticipation built throughout the boxing community. Tickets sold out quickly, with people from all walks of life wanting to witness what many saw as a historic moment. Carlos had transformed from unknown gym cleaner to symbol of perseverance and possibility. But for him, the approaching fight represented not the end of the journey, but the beginning of what he hoped would be a career that could inspire countless others to pursue their own seemingly impossible dreams. The night of Carlos's professional debut arrived with an electric atmosphere at the Araneta Coliseum. The venue, usually reserved for major boxing events, was completely packed with a diverse audience that included traditional boxing fans to families with disabled children who saw Carlos as a symbol of hope. International media were also present, documenting what many considered a historic moment in the sport. Carlos would face Miguel Santos, a respected prospect with an 8-2 record, known for his aggression and experience against unconventional fighters. Santos had initially hesitated to accept the fight, worried about the perception of fighting someone with a disability, but Carlos's growing reputation as a legitimate threat had convinced him it would be a genuine test. In the dressing room before the fight, Carlos maintained his characteristic calm. Manny was by his side, offering last-minute technical advice, but mainly providing emotional support. The team had worked tirelessly to prepare Carlos for this moment, and confidence levels were high despite the magnitude of the occasion. Carlos performed his pre-fight meditation ritual he had developed to center himself. When the walkout music began, Carlos emerged to an enormous roar from the crowd. His entrance was dignified but confident, waving to supporters while maintaining focus on the task ahead. When he entered the ring, standing across from Santos, the contrast in styles and physiques was obvious, but it was also clear that Carlos belonged there based purely on preparation and skill. The opening rounds were cautious, with both fighters feeling each other out. Santos tried to establish dominance through aggression, but quickly discovered that Carlos's defensive skills and counterpunching ability were formidable. Carlos utilized his unique angles to land several clean shots that surprised Santos and energized the crowd. By the middle rounds, the fight had developed into a genuine chess match. Carlos's adaptations allowed him to find success against Santos's orthodox approach, while Santos's experience and physical advantages kept him competitive. Each exchange was tactical, demonstrating that this wasn't a spectacle, but a legitimate professional boxing contest between two skilled athletes. Round 5 proved to be the turning point. Carlos landed a combination that briefly dropped Santos, drawing a massive roar from the crowd. Santos recovered quickly, but momentum had shifted. Carlos began to press his advantage, showing finishing instinct that surprised even his own corner. His combinations were crisp and well-timed, proving that all the training had paid off. The final rounds were an emotional roller coaster. Santos made a desperate push to regain control, but Carlos's conditioning, a result of years cleaning the gym and training obsessively, allowed him to maintain a high pace. When the final bell rang, both fighters embraced in the center of the ring, mutual respect evident. When the judges announced a unanimous decision for Carlos, the place erupted in celebration that lasted several minutes. Carlos had not just won the fight. He had legitimized disabled athletes in professional boxing and inspired countless individuals who previously thought such achievements impossible. In the weeks following Carlos's historic victory, shockwaves spread far beyond the boxing world. His performance had convincingly demonstrated that disability, when combined with dedication and opportunity, didn't necessarily limit achievement. Boxing commissions throughout the world began reviewing policies regarding disabled athletes, with many establishing new protocols for fair evaluation based solely on ability. Carlos became an overnight sensation, not just in the Philippines but internationally. Requests for interviews poured in from global media outlets, all wanting to understand how someone with his challenges had achieved such success. Carlos handled the attention with the same humility he had shown before, always emphasizing that his goal was to open doors for others, not to gain personal fame. Manny's initial decision to train with Carlos was now universally praised as visionary. Boxing experts who had initially criticized the move admitted their prejudices and applauded Manny's ability to see potential where others saw only limitations. The relationship between mentor and student had evolved into a partnership that continued to benefit both fighters significantly. Young boxers with disabilities from around the world began reaching out to Carlos, sharing their own stories and seeking advice. He established an informal support network, offering technical guidance and motivational support to those pursuing boxing despite physical challenges. Several promising fighters emerged from this network, all inspired by Carlos's breakthrough. The boxing community itself underwent subtle but important changes. Sparring sessions in many gyms became more inclusive, with trainers more willing to work with fighters who didn't fit traditional molds. Carlos's success had proven that adaptation and innovation could be as valuable as conventional technique, encouraging broader appreciation for diverse fighting styles. Endorsement deals and sponsorship opportunities appeared, but Carlos was selective, choosing only partnerships that aligned with his values of inclusion and empowerment. He used his newfound financial stability to support the gym where he trained, ensuring that future generations of boxers would have access to better equipment and training resources. Documentary filmmakers approached Carlos about telling his story, but he insisted that any production should focus on broader issues of accessibility in sports, rather than just his personal narrative. The goal was to use his platform to advocate for systemic changes that would benefit many, not just celebrate individual achievement. After establishing himself as a legitimate professional boxer, Carlos continued to fight regularly, building an impressive record while maintaining his advocacy work. Each fight drew audiences interested not only in the competitive aspect, but also in the broader message about the potential of the human spirit to overcome adversity. He had successfully balanced being a serious athlete with being a symbol of hope for marginalized communities. Perhaps most significantly, Carlos's success inspired changes in sports organizations beyond boxing. Federations for other combat sports began examining their own policies regarding disabled athletes, leading to more inclusive participation standards across multiple disciplines. His legacy was already extending far beyond its original scope, creating lasting impact on how society viewed the relationship between disability and athletic achievement. 2 years after his professional debut, Carlos had compiled a record of 12-1, establishing himself as a legitimate contender in his weight class. But his accomplishments in the ring were only part of his impact. He had become a global ambassador for disabled athletes, speaking at conferences worldwide about the potential that exists when barriers are removed and opportunities provided equally. Manny continued as mentor and close friend, with their relationship having evolved into something rare in the sports world. Together, they established a foundation dedicated to supporting aspiring athletes with disabilities, providing financial assistance, training resources, and advocacy for inclusive policies in sports organizations worldwide. The gym where Carlos first trained was renovated and expanded, becoming a specialized training center for athletes with various disabilities. State-of-the-art equipment was installed, and certified trainers were hired specifically to work with adaptive techniques. The center attracted athletes globally, becoming a beacon for inclusive athletic training. Carlos's influence extended beyond just boxing circles. He became a consultant for international Paralympic committees, helping to develop programs that encouraged crossover between Paralympic and traditional sports. His insights were particularly valuable in combat sports, where his experience provided a blueprint for successful integration. Academic studies were conducted on Carlos's technical innovations, with several of his adaptations being incorporated into training methodologies for able-bodied fighters. Sports science researchers found that many of his adjustments actually improved efficiency and reduced injury risk, leading to broader adoption of these techniques throughout amateur and professional boxing. International boxing federations officially recognized Carlos's contributions by establishing an annual award in his honor, given to the fighter who best exemplifies perseverance and innovation in the face of adversity. Award ceremonies became celebrations of diversity in sport, highlighting how inclusion strengthens rather than weakens competitive standards. Years later, Carlos retired from active competition to focus full-time on coaching and advocacy. He had fought some of the best fighters of his generation, earning respect through skill rather than sympathy. His final record of 28-3 included victories over 2 former world champions, solidifying his legacy as a legitimate elite fighter. Today, Carlos's story is taught in sports programs worldwide as an example of how perceived limitations can become sources of innovation and strength. His impact cannot be measured only in wins and losses, but in doors opened for countless others who previously thought their dreams impossible. Manny and Carlos remain close friends and business partners, their foundation having helped hundreds of disabled athletes pursue sports careers that once seemed impossible. Together, they demonstrated that true championship in sports comes not only from individual achievement, but from lifting others up and expanding possibilities for human potential. Their story serves as a reminder that sport at its best breaks down barriers rather than creating them, bringing people together regardless of background or physical ability. Carlos's journey from gym cleaner to professional champion represents more than personal triumph. It symbolizes the potential that exists in everyone when opportunity meets determination. Carlos's legacy continues to inspire new generations of athletes who refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. His life proves that with the right support, training, and opportunity, dreams that seem impossible can become reality. Most importantly, he showed that true victory comes not only from defeating opponents, but from overcoming obstacles that society places in the way of those considered different. In a sport where physical prowess is everything, Carlos demonstrated that heart, mind, and spirit could overcome any physical limitation. His story remains a powerful testament to human potential, and a reminder that the greatest victories often come from those who have faced the greatest challenges. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.